It's been
4 months. 4 months since I last got to one of these videos. It has been way too long. I promised forever ago that I was going to be getting to all of these all at once at some point, and I guess 4 months later I decided that was the right time to do so. I don't know why, but I'm going to be watching Because of You today. I'm going to be watching the Japanese dub version of it. I don't really have a preference of the dub or whatever language I'm watching in because there's really not anything I need to retain from that. It's all visual for these animation analysis videos. And I know a few people hate it when I say that, but it's just the truth. I'm here to analyze the animation. So without further ado, after 4 months, let's get to Because of You, shall we? Let's go. That's quite loud. Ooh. We're starting off with some really good stuff just right away. Oh, this is gonna be a stacked video, isn't it? This is gonna take me forever. What a return. What a video to come back on. Man. I remember the last ones I watched were very well done in all forms of production. And it's like they scaled up from there somehow. Dude, I'm loving this so much now. What? There's so much in the little detail that they're doing. That's even better than it was. They straight up just were like, yeah, let's let them cook. Oh man, the style change there. What? This is gonna take forever for me to break down.
悪いけど、がっかりさせることになるわ。英傑たちの閉幕は盛大で美しくないといけないの。二人だけだと少し寂しいわね。そうでしょ？愛しい絵で。そうね、エリー。始めましょう。
I love this style swap here so much. It's so good. It's so well done. They just nailed it. It's honestly pretty interesting just seeing the modern designs done in a more retro style like that. Like the modern clothing and everything, that's kind of neat to see done well. It's not like a full reimagining either, but it's definitely that style switch. That's really selling me on this a lot. Oh man, we got the trigger stars. Talked about those before.
見て、彼らはあんなに誇らしげに生き、命で文明の昇華を奏でた。これは英傑と呼ばれた人々の話。13人の出演者が経験した未完の旅。けど来訪者、あなたの道は続いてる。そうでしょ？なら心のままに進みなさい。
Yo, man. I feel like I should be saying more, but I'm just enjoying the visual candy in front of me. Even the way they're approaching CG this time around feels a little bit more clean than the last one. It was clean before, but for real.
死した者たちの墓を越え、私たちが作れなかった未来を作りなさい。
Ooh, man. What a set of impact frames, too. Dude. I'm gonna have to be so picky about what I talk about here. There's so much. There's so much I want to talk about. I'm gonna make sure there's nothing else here at the end. Oh, okay, there is something. Don't know if it'll be anything worth talking about. Just a little bit. I mean, that was just kind of like a little spot at the end there. It's not really anything I think I would talk about. It has some really beautiful lighting, though. So the first thing I find interesting in this that's worth talking about, I know I showed a lot of interest in that first section where she was being attacked by those like giant plug things, but there wasn't really anything too technical that I haven't already beaten to death in other videos before, so I decided to skip it. This one was kind of cool, though. Specifically, as she's falling here, this is a very subtle detail, but as the eye opens up, there's all that glitching happening on screen. In this specific frame right here, it happens in a couple of them in slightly different ways, but specifically this one is a really clear way to see it, is this fact that she is not blurred out, but stuff that's in the environment is other than the TV. So like, obviously that TV is glitching out and everything, and that's kind of the whole point. As it turns on, you're getting that visual switch, but like, especially this frame here, as you can see that this spot over here is blurring and then going back to normal, and she doesn't do that. So that's one of two things. One is probably reading too far into it. Two is just the technical side. One is that maybe that's on purpose and they're trying to show a separation of the character from the environment and the place she's in, to show that like main character, you know, like pay attention to them, keep your eyes focused on them, but also the rest of the screen being taken up by this gigantic eye is also something else to focus on. So you're not really noticing those details, but it might be a way of subtly pushing that agenda of making you feel like you're more connected to the main character in this case. It would make sense, but again, reading too far into it potentially. It could also just be something simple, like being part of the composition process. It's very likely that she was rendered out separately from the rest of this shot, so when they applied effects to it that were stuff like that blur, it didn't affect her, because why would it be there? And it just could be a byproduct of that. I'm thinking it might be a little bit of both personally. I feel like they would want to showcase some of that separation to make the main character more obvious on the screen, especially in that moment, just to not lose where she is visually. If you were to blur that at any point, unless it's completely intended, it might have the opposite effect of drawing your eyes to a different part of the screen when you're not intending to. So it's very possible that it was a mix of both. That's what I'm going to go with. But I just thought it was kind of neat and wanted to talk about that because I don't see that sort of thing often. Usually it's pretty uniform when they do effects like that, so having the background have a complete blur for like a frame or two in the middle of that sort of a transition and keeping her very crisp on screen was just kind of different, so I thought it was worth mentioning. And literally a couple of frames later we get this little transition here, which is fun but also a little goofy for the obvious reason of distance between the two. As she's falling, you see she's starting to rotate here and starting to get into that like landing stance that she ends up in, and this shot right here is completely different. She was way over here the last time we saw her, and now she's all the way over here, and it's just a completely different spot. And it's just one of those things that I've talked about before where if it looks cool, it doesn't matter if it actually works in physics or in the case of location in the world. If it looks neat, that's all you need sometimes. This is a perfect example of that. It was a great transition, very smooth, already had her rotating before landing, so you already got that information in your head. You weren't wondering why she magically flipped around between those shots. That's something I feel a much more amateur animator would have done to this sequence, and it would have felt worse as a result, but that's the type of detail that I love out of these projects. Those little things that you don't really think about, but subconsciously they play a pretty big piece. And it's like, yeah, she's of course moved like a good couple hundred meters away, but it's also like, yeah, you have to get things clear on screen, and this helps land the character in a spot that's a much more visually interesting perspective from her to this power she's going to be facing, and that is a dynamic that's very popular in all media and direction in general, is creating this sense of power dynamic between two characters. Have a character seem much smaller than the other one, and immediately they seem like the underdog. It's just a way to make that work out for the viewer, and this does that very much so. There's this giant hulking tower of screens that apparently is a villain, and you know it just by seeing this happen, even though she's on screen larger than this other character. And as we go ahead, of course, you get a few more frames in here. You see that she's also pretty large on screen, but that's another factor of that exact same directorial choice. You don't want her to seem like she's completely out of her element, completely unlikely to win this battle. You want her also somewhat large on screen in comparison to this other being. So while she does definitely seem smaller and has that underdog vibe coming from her as a result of this shot, she also doesn't seem incompetent in facing it because she is taking up such a large portion of the screen as well. That's just great directorial choice, and again, the reason I'm forgiving that whole distance not making sense thing, because it looks good and it does make sense for the overall feeling you're trying to get out of the characters here. I'm just letting this little spot play through because I love the movement in here. I'm loving everything about her pass, especially when she did do this spot here where she like jumped up and struck it. That like flash of the light on her, that reflection off her character model was so crisp and clean. It felt so responsive. And we're also getting a great example of this thing I've talked about before where the background and environment is separated from the character in order to create a speed dynamic between the two to make her seem faster. The background is moving at a slightly different frame rate from the character model, so it just makes her seem like she's running faster than a normal person would. That can be used for a normal person as well, just to make them seem a little extra zippy on the screen. But in this context, it works really well because she can move that fast, and it's making the rest of the environment feel like it's trying to catch up to her in a way, instead of making everything blur like a lot of traditional animation, 2D animation would do instead of this. It's using the flexibility of that CG environment in order to make it feel more coherent between the two, instead of having her drawn on 2D versus the 3D background, which can sometimes and often, if not done right, even though they never really seem to get that wrong in this team, but sometimes that jarring relationship between having a 2D character running through a CG environment just doesn't feel right. And in this, having her work so smoothly in here and having that parallax with the background just makes her feel like she's one with the scene, and it works really well. This sort of a thing I'm not so sure about, because I feel like it has to do with the character's abilities or maybe the villain's abilities, kind of putting them back to where they were. But this sort of like reverse thing was pretty interesting to see, but I'm pretty sure that it's something to do with like the way she's processing this world and her ability there. Maybe she's able to sense things a little bit further ahead, and maybe she's able to take that information, process it, and choose a better path or action instead of the one she just took, or it straight up was just like a reality glitch happening inside this virtual world she seems to be in. I'm again pretty loose on what the story is. It has been a while since I've watched a lot of these, but I'm pretty sure they're in some sort of virtual world, but I'm not going to try to figure that out right now. So just wanted to say that that was a pretty neat choice to be able to show just like a glitch. It was just like a frame or two of her reverting back with that effect on top. It was very clean, very quick, but people who understand the story and know what's going on with these characters would be able to pick that up very quick. It's leaning a little bit into that understanding, but even with myself not understanding everything about this world that they're in, I kind of got what they were going for there. So that's a really well done directorial choice too. Another small detail here, but I liked that it existed at all, and I wanted to see more about what this text down here had to say, if it was actual code or anything even close to it. It is fairly close. I don't know if there's proper syntax here in a lot of ways, but at the same time, I love that it had stuff like scan param, capture event, delete scan param, return, and then like scan param instance this. Like this instance right here, the one we're in, duh. I love that that's just the label here. That's just made me laugh. Those little details, especially since they do seem somewhat accurate from the little code language I do know, that's really interesting that they put in that effort to make sure that there was something at least somewhat sensible in there for something that would be on screen for a couple of glitchy frames for this one spot. And I know that it happens a few other times, but just the fact that it's there again at all, really neat. I just wanted to talk about it. I'm not going to look into every single one for an Easter egg or something, but I just love that they included that, and I wanted to give it a little bit of a highlight. This shot right here is kind of to pair up with that other one from earlier showing the dynamics on screen. Here we have the two characters that we're trying to focus on are very much more similarly sized on screen. It's starting to show maybe a change of that perspective of who is in charge. The fact that she is showing much more power here, the fact that this character is just kind of there and it's just like, oh, maybe, oh shit. Like, I like that they did that. It's, again, directorial choices, very well done. I like the hard lighting on her too, this very aggressive lighting going on here. It's very well silhouetted. I like that it's actually holding so tight to every curve on her body. Usually these harsh lights would do that, but I appreciate that they're overwhelming these lights in the background. Like this one should technically be shining some sort of a backlight on her, but there's only a little bit of a maybe soft vignette coming around the side of her hair there. So there's not too much interference from the other lights in this world. It's another one of those subtle detail bits, but that's really what this team tends to shine in. Those tiny details that really sell a lot in the subconscious as far as power scaling goes matter so much. And I think they did a very good job here, especially with that, just making everything on this shot right here feel so much more power driven. Like they're preparing you to be ready for this power shift until the next spot happens where it all goes wrong. I'm just letting this play through too because I love this so much, but there's not really much to talk about in frozen frames here. This fall, one of the cleanest CG falls I've seen out of pretty much any property. The physics on this shot alone are just gorgeous. I mean, the lighting and everything, these lights kind of like going between her and making up a little bit more visual noise is actually doing a lot for this sequence as well. It's hiding some of those minor inconsistencies discrepancies that CG does have with physics, but there's just enough noise going on around her that you really can't notice those. There's too many lighting changes. It's definitely too harsh of a light, so you really don't see any of that, especially compared to the background where it's a lot more smooth and there's like gradient, like glowing effect on the floor. There's just a lot of lighting support helping out her character model in that stumble. It's maybe not the most smooth CG shot I've ever seen for a fall like that or being tossed back and tumbling on the floor, but it is a really well done one, especially for the property. So I just gotta point it out when things are done well, as I do, and that was a great one. This like meld transition that goes into the eye, I'm actually kind of curious how that worked. I feel like it could have been something simple like a liquid or a smoke simulation that's creating some sort of like a noisy fractal that's like engulfing the character, and they're making it disappear using the alpha channel, which would make the character become transparent, and that's just how they're going through it. I also think there was a little bit here that adjusting it by changing the brightness, that overall exposure, and those glitches on screen right as she kind of goes in entirely. But I am curious. I know I'll probably never get the answer on that one, but I do wonder, actually. The smoke sim one is probably the one I would do if I were to do it, just because I think that would be the easiest, but I'm also not this professional, so there might be a way out there that I just don't know about. And I just want to go through this one frame by frame while I'm talking about it, because I love this. This is such a cool transition, having the full model kind of peel back. You see a little bit of this wireframe underneath her as well. It kind of follows down that gradient where it ends up in the like hand-drawn sketch section of her design, I suppose. And I just think that's really neat. I also love the detail about like the eye being scribbled out, and like stuff like that is really cool to me. The arms not really being there, but still having that scribbled stump is neat. I just love this. I love that everything kind of wraps itself around that aesthetic, and it's like, hey, we're going into this, even down to like the 4x3, like crushing the whole curved corner monitor look. That's neat. They were just doing a standard 3/4 before that. I thought that was pretty cool on its own, just seeing that retro aesthetic. It's one of my favorite things personally. I love that retro aesthetic, and this is just taking that to a whole nother level by adjusting everything around it. And like I was talking about earlier with those characters, just the straight up design choices here. I loved that all those numbers just spill out like they're separate entities. There's so much happening here that I love, and I just want to play it through and watch it again while I talk about it, because it is so much fun. There's a lot happening, obviously, throughout this entire sequence here, but I love this, how all the ones and zeros, the binary is starting to rebuild itself around here, things starting to go wrong on the surface world, and like just setting all this up. And then you get to see this fully fledged out character, so you know exactly the aesthetic they're going for. I love the colors here, the softness in the colors, the filtering that they put on that to make that happen. And again, the redesigns to make them just look a little bit more aesthetic in this world, this retro feel they've got. Their designs on the face are just a little bit more retro. I would put this in like early 90s, like maybe mid 90s anime style, especially with how the color is just kind of overblown in their hair. The highlights especially just being a little too overexposed is pretty classic of those old recordings of older anime, and you just don't see that really. What's a fun fact about VHS and that whole aesthetic that people love to borrow from to do stuff like this is that these colors didn't actually look like this. This is because of degradation of the film and sometimes the CRT that you would be playing them on, the old tube TV, and the colors of their hair are not at all what you actually got. There's a few projects out there that are actually trying to restore the original color palette to old shows like Sailor Moon, I believe is one of them, and a few others out there that were really popular. Slayers might be another one. There's a few that people are just trying to resurrect that original image from this type of aesthetic so they could see how it was originally intended instead of this sort of like washed out sort of look. And while we all enjoy that aesthetic, I'm sure, it's still something that I love that people are doing, trying to keep the original concept in mind, that original approach, and trying to make that also accessible for people who never got the chance to experience it as a kid, or did experience it as a kid, and maybe the kid wants to see how it actually would have looked. So it's just a cool thing. I think it's pretty neat. I was unfortunately old enough at the time where this was still popular to be able to remember this sort of look. And while I do remember this sort of glow, it's probably, again, the result of me watching on CRTs as a kid. We didn't have flat screens until I was a few years older than that. So just to see that sort of approach and this sort of aesthetic being kept alive even by modern standards and in modern companies because they think it's cool, I love that so much. I'm not going to go too much farther into this sequence just because I have talked about a lot of the stuff I wanted to already in that prior bit, but I just want to watch this again. It's so neat. A lot of the effects are fun, but I've already talked about a lot of them in other videos, so I don't want to keep retreading ground by saying the same exact thing in every video, but I just love this. It looks so neat. It's fun to watch. This is the type of sequence I could watch 10 times over and still find something to talk about. Speaking of, something that happened right there as I was talking that I wanted to get to, but I forgot happened that soon, was this little bit here. Right as all of this happens, you would think this might be an impact frame, but it's actually just a light passing in front of the camera, and that's pretty cool too, because like they blur everything out, everything becomes defocused, which would happen and does happen when your exposure tries to adjust on older cameras. They used to try adjusting that way, a lot of them, and while it doesn't happen as much for modern cameras, like if I were to get really close to mine, it would just drop the exposure. It doesn't try to like readjust as much. The sensors weren't as good back then, so having these sorts of old sensor things in here, this dust and scratchiness that's happening, and trying to adjust for all that change on screen, shows just a little bit more of that dedication to the aesthetic of having that analog world that they're in, and I love that. This sort of like 90s idea of what the future would be, this 80s concept of futuristic tech, and stuff like this was still happening back then, as if it wouldn't be solved by the time we showed up. And this entire sequence is gorgeous. I can't really talk enough about this one. I would be here for 20 minutes trying to break down every explosion that happens here. It's just so puffy and lively. It's so beautiful. Every little dot in that sequence there where she's like coming out and doing the whole like kiss thing, that's sick as hell. I just don't want to be here forever talking about it, so I decided to skip over it and go for a few other things here at the end. One of those things being this power shift. We finally reached the full power shift. The character is finally much larger than the main one, or at very least roughly equivalent to the main villain. But now that we have that power shift, we can understand visually that she is finally here to take out this main villain and has the strength and ability to do so. So you get that dynamic shift fully after like 2 or 3 fake outs during this whole project. And I love that. Also, the effects animation on that was just gorgeous. I just, again, cannot talk about that enough, but we will talk about that amazing right there impact shot. This has got to be one of my favorite impact sequences of the entire set of videos I've watched for Impact Third here. This is insanely clean. You get a few different inversions here. It works really well. You can see most detail here. Again, everything just spreading out away from the center as all of them do. A few trigger stars thrown in there. It's just good aesthetic, especially in impact shots and impact frames. Having those are very visually distinct and very aggressive, since they're all pointed, so they're easy to tell that there's an explosion happening. It's a good way to simplify explosions, which is why I'm sure they're used in multiple projects, but they work really well in impact frames just because of that aggression to them. They're very, very visually distinct, so even in those few frames, you're able to process what's going on and what's happening behind the explosion that you're experiencing. But I love that they also throw in some random geometric ones like this and the one that follows it. It's very simplistic here. I feel like these are what I call the nonsense frames, which are just there to add a few extra frames of nonsense, just to fill in some of that gap in the time you may need in order to make things time out well and feel good, because none of what's happening here really tracks with what was on screen so much. Like if we were to keep track of like this spot right here, you see that that's here, but it's a completely different shape now. And even here, it's like now that one's gone, but like the shape down down here is smaller, roughly the same, but there's like not really any rhyme or reason for them. But that's why I love impact frames in general, that sort of detail. But sometimes you don't need to show all that detail explicitly for the explosion. You can just show some nonsense, and as long as it times out well, it'll still feel like an impact. It'll still feel like a random explosion, because even though they're geometric and have no sense or shape on them that's really specific to what just happened, you're still getting that extra time to process the prior ones, and by the time those are done, you're understanding what you just saw by just having a few random nonsense frames in there. That's a very small, very niche thing to talk about maybe, but I do love me some impact frames, as we all know, so that's just one of those things I wanted to talk about. And there actually is something I want to talk about. As I mentioned, the lighting on this sequence is very gorgeous. I love the overall color palette of this too. It's so pretty and uniform. It's so good. At the same time, there is definitely a volumetrics thing happening with her hair. You're seeing the light coming from this direction and going through her hair, but I want you to see specifically a few frames in here. You can see it kind of moving throughout, but you're creating these shadows as her hair flicks up, and you're seeing the light kind of go through it. There is a really good example right here. You're seeing the light go through that. So this light exists in the shot with her. It's not something that was comped in. It's in there. The light source does exist to brighten her up in the engine, and then as her hair flicks around, everything is reacting to that. It's kind of got RTX on, so to speak. It's just showing these lights and shining them through. It's a God ray effect, but all of the atmosphere around her, which is very likely a light smoke sim of sorts, is adapting all of that information and scattering it around and making it feel like there's more atmosphere in the area. It's almost making it feel, you could say, dusty and smoky in most contexts. But with this one, you could say, hey, maybe it's just a bunch of pollen, because that would be the particulate scattering all of the light in a place like this that is literally all flowers. So it's a cool, very minor detail, beautiful addition to this shot. It makes everything feel that much more harmonious with the rest of the shot. All the colors kind of bake together a little bit better underneath that atmosphere as well. So it just feels so good. I love this one. This is definitely my favorite project that they've had, hands down, to date. I have a feeling that Graduation might end up beating this one out just based on how many people really want me to get to that one. But man, what a beautiful, beautiful sequence. But I think that's about all I've got to say. There were a few things I'm definitely going to have to cut out of this one just because I was talking way too long. My recording here is an hour exactly at this point, so I know it's going to take a while to cut all this down and actually pick out the spots I want to talk about. So what you see is definitely the highlights of it. And I did say this during the main video, but I really don't want to retread all the same topics I have before. So if you have anything that you think I should have talked about, I've probably talked about it in other animation analysis videos before, and you should probably give those a shot if you haven't already and are somehow watching this for the first time. But I digress. As I said, I'm going to be getting to Graduation next, and that'll kind of wrap up the main story of Impact Third for me. If there are any smaller side story ones that I haven't gotten to yet, please let me know, and I will get to them after Graduation, but I wanted to make sure I got all the main ones done first, so I'll be doing that and finishing it off this month. There'll be another one next week, and that will be it for the main of Impact Third, and then I'll start maybe prodding into some of the stuff from Star Rail or other properties a little bit more too. It has been a while since I've done one of these videos in general, longer so for specifically Impact Third, but I've just had so many other things going on in my life that I'm finally able to get to more of these, and I miss doing them more. I legitimately do love to nerd out about these animation projects, and I get to share my knowledge with everyone, and I know that a lot of you like it too. So if you want to see more and you have something you want me to do specifically, drop it down in the comments below and I will do my best to get to it as always. And of course, if you like this video and you want to follow me and support me for more in the future, you know how to do all that, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye!